morning, everyone. Morning. Good morning. Wow. Welcome to Primetime at Bethel University Library. Primetime celebrates the learning in and beyond the classroom of Bethel faculty, students, and staff, and is a collaborative project between the Friends of Bethel University Library, faculty development, and other offices on campus. Join us again for a second Primetime presentation this afternoon. Come back at 1 p.m. where Edgren Scholars Doctor of Nursing Kristen Sandow and senior nursing student Karen Kanakis discuss their research on living with a left ventricular assist device. This morning, we are so proud and happy to welcome senior social work majors Christabella Morse, Cudo Barton, Alyssa Knight, and Madeline Hoffert as they share about their path to the National BPD Conference and their presentations that bring attention to the U.S. southern border crisis with the refugees, as well as systemic violence against indigenous women, in order to provide advocacy for various policy efforts to address these injustices. By way of a brief introduction, I want to talk a little bit just about the pathway to the Canadian Museum of Human Rights. So in the fall of 2017, without any prior planning, we introduced it to our senior class and we said, hey, want to go to the Winnipeg Museum of Canadian Human Rights? And they said yes. So in the fall of last year, we raised about $10,000. And in January, right before spring semester started, about 25 of us hopped in a bus and traveled to Winnipeg, Canada to visit the Canadian Museum of Human Rights, which is the only museum in the world that's purely devoted to human rights. And it proved to be a transformational experience for our students in terms of how they understood human rights. In November of this year, 4 of our students submitted proposals to present at a national conference that was held in Florida in April. And our 4 students that will be presenting today were actually accepted to present at the conference. This is the first time that social work students have traveled to present at a national conference. Their presentations were focused on advocacy, and they did a most excellent job. In fact, 2 of our students won first place in the competition at a national competition. So we're very, very, very proud of them and excited for the work. I should also mention that these students took this on. It wasn't a part of their project and their research that they were already doing. This was in addition to their regular schoolwork. So that was a big job, and they spent a lot of time on it. Prior to welcoming them, I would like to take a moment to recognize Dr. John Bauer, who is sitting in the back and who was chair of the social work department at Bethel University for 28 years.
Well, maybe 5.
Or 5. You'll have to talk to him after. But we are so grateful that you and your wife have joined us today, and for the continued support even beyond your time here. So welcome to you. Thank you so much for coming. So without any further delay, I think we should give him a hand clap. That's a lot of I would ask him to stand up, but he said he has some knee stuff, so you look really comfortable, so we'll let you stay sitting. So without any further delay, I would like to present Christabella and Madeline, who will come and spend about 15 minutes talking about the border crisis, and then we'll turn it over to Alyssa and Katie, who will be talking about the indigenous violence against indigenous women. So please give them some encouragement. This is like...
Thank you, Edie. I'm Madeline.
And I'm Christabella.
And we're going to be talking to you today about human rights and how it relates to the refugee crisis observed both globally and along our southern border. So as Edie has said, last January we had the opportunity to go to the Museum of Human Rights in Winnipeg, Canada, and while being there, Christabella and I came across an exhibit that brought light to the refugee crisis. And it was told through the perspective of 2 young boys. One, Achilles Soares, who was the artist, and he took discarded life jackets from the shores of Greece, which is oftentimes a landing spot for Syrian refugees. And he created this sort of like a makeshift shelter out of these life jackets that were collected on the shores. And the second perspective came through Mustafa al-Said, who was a 13-year-old Syrian refugee that was uprooted by conflict from his city in Aleppo, and he came to Greece to seek refuge with his mother and brother. So yeah, this exhibit just really was the inspiration behind going to Florida to advocate for human rights.
So an overview of the refugee crisis, just for context, a definition for a refugee is someone who is forced to leave their home country due to war, persecution, or violence, where an asylum seeker is someone who chooses to leave and applies for asylum within another country to flee political corruption within their country. So this is just a graphic that shows some statistics around the worldwide crisis of that refugees face. So 68.5 million people are currently displaced as a result of conflict and persecution in their home countries, and 50% of these refugees are under the age of 18. So this just shows that a lot of families are being forced to uproot their lives for things that they don't have control over.
So switching gears a little bit and talking more closely to the refugee crisis that we see on the southern border, I think this quote is very powerful and tells the narrative of immigrants and refugees and asylum seekers that are coming to the border that often is untold. And it's that the enemy is not the refugee. The enemy is the one who made him a refugee. And I think this is important to touch on because U.S. foreign policy has contributed to the destabilization of Central America. There has been decades of controversial and complex U.S. foreign policy that has directly destabilized Latin America in many ways. One of those ways happened in the 1980s when the U.S. government partnered with World Bank to begin to impose policies that favored multinational corporations, which then began to undercut farmers and small businesses, which often provided a wage for the middle class and the working poor. When I was doing research on this, I also found that a lot of people that were higher up in these multinational corporations also became partners with the narco trafficking business. And people high up were also often protected by the U.S. government as well. So at this time, there began to see a rise of gang violence throughout the region, which contributed to a lot of the violence, gang-related activity, rape, murder, and sex trafficking. And just a quote that I came across in my research that I think does a good job of illustrating this further was from a young Guatemalan man, and it says, "Unless you are connected to one of the families that run this country, there is no future here. You either work for the narcos or you go north." And I think that just does a great job at illustrating the fact that we kind of see this trap between individuals that are fleeing for their lives because of U.S. foreign policy and coming to the border to seek asylum, and then domestic policy stating like there's no room for you here, and sending individuals back to persecution, back to violence. So it's here that we can see the two at odds with each other and individuals trapped in between those two policies. So.
Just a quick overview of the migrant caravan, which was the main refugee issue we decided to focus on since it is current. It started in October of 2018 last year when 7,200 men, women, and children fled Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. As you can see in this map, it took these migrants a month to reach the U.S.-Mexico border. And a lot of the reason why these migrants decided to flee their home countries was to escape gang violence, persecution, political violence, and the abysmal poverty that exists within developing countries. And a lot of the violence that these migrants face on their journey to the border is sexual violence, robbery, and even death. So as you can see, like 200 people went either missing or were murdered as they fled their home countries to look for a safer life. And when this first started, President Trump declared the migrant caravan an invasion and deployed 5,800 troops to the border as a way to counteract their actions, and also threatened to cut off economic aid to Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. Last year, only 12 migrants were reported to have died within detention, and this year, only 22 migrants have been reported dead. And I think it's safe to assume that this number is not accurate and doesn't tell the whole truth of what happens once migrants reach the border and are being detained. And U.S. federal law states that those fleeing serious persecution are considered refugees, and the U.S. has a legal obligation to hear asylum claims and refugee claims of violence and why they are afraid to return to their home countries. And as of last month this year, it's been reported that there are 103,492 refugees currently at the border.
So looking at specific policy here, some of you may be familiar with the zero tolerance policy and some of you may not, but this is just a general overview of how it contributed to family separation. So May 7, 2018, Attorney General Jeff Sessions announced that the Department of Justice was going to implement the zero tolerance policy toward illegal immigration solely to discourage and deter illegal entry. So what this meant was that anyone that was crossing the border, whether that be at a port of entry or anywhere in between, or if you were an asylum seeker or if you were accompanied by minor children, as soon as you crossed that border, 100% of the people were going to be prosecuted. So what we know is that adults were tried in criminal court, and obviously children cannot be a part of that process. So that is where the family separation would happen. Children were transferred to the Office of Refugee Resettlement, and it was documented that there are 121 different shelters across 7 different states that children were displaced and scattered to upon that separation. This policy was stopped on the 20th of June of 2018 because of a class action lawsuit that was condemning Trump's practices with separating families. And at that time, there was around 3,000 children that had already been separated. And it wasn't until recently that this class action lawsuit also included a zero tolerance trial run in 2017 where children were being separated long before this policy even was rolled out. And in a more recent report by the Office of Inspector General, since the class action has required parents to be reunited with their children, there is still large disparities in trying to identify children that were separated from their parents, as well as there is still reported cases of families still being separated at the border as we speak. And then also another important consideration is the systemic oppression and the risk of safety that asylum seekers are enduring even before reaching the border. There's been reports of significant human rights violations and severe trauma as individuals journey to try to seek asylum in the United States. And then asylum seekers are also subject to arbitrary detention. And I say arbitrary detention because outlined by the detention guidelines in the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees, it's actually unlawful and illegal to detain asylum seekers unless they pose a significant flight risk or a high risk to society. And I would argue that the majority of asylum seekers are not either one of those two things. So just that in and of itself is a violation to human rights.
And also part of the systemic oppression is the fact that we know separation causes irreparable harm to children. And a Psychology Today article kind of laid this out as when you're a child and your family's fleeing your home country and you're uprooting your entire life, that itself is just a very uncomprehensible situation. But then of course you're walking and you're going on this long journey and you arrive to a place where you don't know people, you don't know the language, and the whole situation of why this is happening is so ambiguous. And of course then you come and you get separated from your family, which just increases the trauma that occurs, and children often will internalize that, and this can lead to mental health disorders in adulthood, which affect the rest of their lives that they don't have a choice over. But then also when families are reunited, it often results in an insecure or disorganized attachment to their family. And also, so going into why these are human rights violations, Article 9 states that no one shall be subjected to arbitrary arrest, detention, or exile, while Article 14 states everyone has the right to seek and enjoy other countries' asylum from persecution. This right may not be involved in the case of persecution genuinely arising from non-political crimes or acts contrary to the purpose and principles of the United Nations. Some alternatives that have been implemented as the Family Separation Act has been removed are community-based programming, which is an alternative to detention that allows families to stay together in a community setting during the immigration process and proceedings that they have to go through. Some of the policy implications along with this as well is the Migrant Protection Protocol, where if refugees approach the border and they don't have proper identification, then they are forced to return to Mexico, where they're provided with humanitarian protection for the duration of their immigration proceedings until it can be decided if they will be accepted as asylum seekers or refugees, or if they need to be deported. Some other things that have been revised throughout this event is the credible fear screening, is that it has been revised to be more harsh and make it harder for immigrants to prove that they have viable fear of returning to their home countries. And even with these revisions, 90% of immigrants pass this credible fear screening, but only 10% are granted asylum. So there is a great disparity in the selection process that is occurring once the screening is complete. And just some violations within the Trump administration to national human rights is their declaration that screening tools are used as loopholes to get immigrants into the country illegally and to allow them to stay here, while they are also seeking to dismantle the U.S. asylum system just by narrowing the definitions and making requirements harder to pass and meet. But also, even though the family separation policy has been discontinued, many families are still being separated, even if they have proper identification that declares who they are and who their relation to one another is. And something that was actually proposed last night was a charge or a fee being put on asylum applications, which would just be another level of difficulty for asylum seekers and refugees to seek safety.
So what is our call to action? I think that when we learn about injustice, we kind of become agitated and we want to do something, but maybe we think that our voice isn't significant enough. But I want to say that 100% is. One step could just be to make yourself more aware of maybe U.S. foreign policy that creates situations that perpetuate the marginalization of people. So maybe it's not the refugee crisis, but maybe it's another issue that you're just very passionate about. So making yourself more aware of policy and implications and things that go into that. Another point is to talk to your legislators and advocate for a policy that supports human rights and the dignity of all people. I was doing some research, and Minnesota has a lot of nonprofit organizations that are both here and at the border working to bring justice to asylum seekers. So maybe it's getting plugged in with that, or even donating to nonprofit organizations that are doing this work already. And then lastly, I just want to end on the fact that human rights are everywhere. It doesn't take a crisis such as this to talk about human rights, but human rights they happen in our hallways, they happen in our workplace, they happen in our friend groups and our families, and there will always be opportunities to advance the dignity and worth of all people. So we're going to wait on questions for right now, but that concludes our presentation, and we're going to pass off our time to Katie and Alyssa.
Well, I am Alyssa and Katie, and for our research, it's a very different angle. We looked at systemic violence against Indigenous women. And one compelling exhibit that we saw at the Human Rights Museum was one titled The Red Dress Project by artist Jamie Black. And it was empty red dresses hanging up in order to be a visual representation of the large number of missing and murdered Indigenous women throughout all of North America. And so there's a lot of intentionality behind each piece of it, as in the red is a sacred color in Indigenous communities as a way to call the spirits back of the women, have them come back home, as well as dresses to show that this is a gender-based violence issue. And so when Katie and I saw this, it really inspired us to start looking at the issue more into it. And then through our research, we found that the primary issue is that Indigenous women living on and off tribal lands are overrepresented in missing or murdered women cases.
Yeah, so as we started to look more into the research, what is this issue, where is it evident, we found that some of the barriers include jurisdictional reporting. So there is a lot of confusion about who has responsibility to not only investigate, but track and report on cases where Indigenous women have gone missing or been murdered. So that's between tribal, state, federal agencies. There's a lot of confusion within who has that responsibility. Also, when we think about how the long-term effects of historical oppression and colonization have impacted this community, and how we think about this community, the Indigenous community, as being less than indifferent. And so, for example, during colonization, there were patriarchal beliefs that has very rigid gender roles that were instilled on a very matrilineal community. And so within the Indigenous communities, gender roles were a lot more complementary and fluid, and so are flexible, and so that has been an impact on the community. And then also looking at how the ongoing marginalization of the degradation of their spiritual practices. And so Indigenous religions are very distinct from Western religions, and so they have a lot more belief on practices and rituals rather than text or doctrine and theology. And so ritualistic religions are a lot more poorly understood since the Westernized is more dominant in America. And so we also found that documentation is another big barrier. And so it's not only the effects that continue to happen because of historical oppression, but continuous documentation. For example, failure to recognize diversity. This community we've referred to is as Indigenous, but they also may identify as First Nations or American Indian or Indian American or Aboriginal. But classification and identification systems don't allow for that, or their identification within a specific clan or tribe. There's just not the allowance for their diversity in identification. There's also decades of missing data. So when we were looking to the research, law enforcement databases go back to the 1940s, but 2/3 of the cases for missing and murdered Indigenous women occurred between 2010 and 2018. And so between 1940s and 2010, there's just decades literally of missing data. So when the lack of sustained reporting then minimizes the issue because it's something that we don't know about, we don't have the data to show, which continues to perpetuate the violence against the specific community. So for example, in 2016, there were 5,712 cases reported of missing and murdered Indigenous women, but only 116 of those were logged in the Department of Justice database.
And just really like building off of what Katie was talking about, like through our research, another major barrier that we found was looking at institutional racism, which is the process of like intentional discrimination against a group of individuals with biased laws or practices. And this is seen throughout the U.S. in many ways, but like for our research in this topic specifically, it was in like just jurisdictional databases. And so one major biased practice that we found is that when a body of a woman is found throughout the U.S., if the race is unknown, it is classified as white in the system. And so there's like misrepresentation of data. People are misunderstanding like it's data, but it's also like human lives, and it's women that are not being recognized within our system. And so then, as Katie was saying, like that's just how in society we are viewing the topic. And then that really plays into just the overall like media bias. So in 2018, out of 506 cases that are documented, only 95% were never talked about in international or national news outlets. So people are not hearing about this topic, and so then there's no necessarily like advocacy is short because they're not understanding what they should be advocating for. And then when it is talked about, 31% of these media outlets use violent language, and so that would be talking about like the victim's criminal history, if there's any gang affiliation or drug use, just a lot of the like stereotypical things that are associated with Indigenous communities. And this was even seen, we read an article last month from Minnesota. There was a woman found in Minneapolis who was murdered, and the first line of the article talked about heroin use and her experiencing homelessness before it got into how she was murdered. And so it's not something that's far-fetched throughout the US, but it's here in Minnesota as well. And one stat, like it's not something that is just on reservations, but like 71% of Indigenous communities live in urban areas. And so then this kind of makes the topic as a whole, it's not Indigenous communities doing this to themselves. We found that 4 out of 5 cases of either sexual assault or physical assault were done by non-Indigenous individuals done to Indigenous women. And so the whole lens that the media and society is looking at this, as Katie said, is just perpetuating these negative stereotypes and a false lens on the issue.
So what do we do with this? We are calling for mandating a comprehensive assessment of the systems that continue to perpetuate this violence against Indigenous women. And so when we started looking into what is being done about it, we know that there's this issue, but I don't know, like now that we know about it, what next? And so we found that North Dakota actually has been one of the front runners in starting to address these issues. So stemming from Savannah's Act, a 22-year-old woman in 2017, she was found murdered, and so a 22-year-old pregnant woman was found murdered in a river. And so that kind of sparked a response from one of the senators to put this into place. So Savannah's Act, which would increase coordination between the law enforcement agencies and require a standardized reporting in the federal government. And so that was seen in North Dakota, but when we were doing research, we found that Minnesota actually has the 9th most missing or murdered Indigenous women cases throughout the United States. So that's a big deal for us here in Minnesota. So when we started looking a little bit deeper into what are we doing as a state, we found that Representative Kunish-Podin, she started a file that would create a task force in Minnesota, and that task force would consist of Indigenous and non-Indigenous members that would need to look into the issue and then report to the commissioner about ways to reduce violence and how to then support those who have experienced it or somebody in their family has, and the trauma that continues to go on throughout the community. And so we were able to then go down, so this is currently in the House right now. We were able to go during Social Work Day at the Capitol, and we spoke with my personal representative, Representative Wozlowick, and we were able to talk to her because she's actually a supporter of this bill. And so we were talking to her about what's kind of going on with it, or where are we at, and she said that she's hopeful for it, that it would be passed and then sent over to the Senate. But we asked her, what are kind of the barriers that you're experiencing? What's kind of the pushback? And a lot of it is just a lack of awareness that this is an issue. So that's where we come in. She was very grateful that we were out there talking about it, that we shared about our experience in Florida, we shared about our experience here at Bethel, and just really kind of helping spread awareness about this issue so that people do recognize it is an issue and it doesn't continue to perpetuate. From there, since our time in Florida, we, just last week I sent Alyssa this article that I found that Washington State Senate has actually passed and is on the way, or it's probably in the hands of the governor now, to be signed, that would require the Washington State Patrol to develop best practices protocol for law enforcement response to missing and murdered Indigenous women on and off tribal land, which is a huge step for Washington, as they were also, I believe, within the top 10 of having the most cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women.
Yeah, and so throughout our research, we just saw like this is a gender and racialized violence, and like this is an issue that we need to start talking about more. And since the conference we went to focused on human rights, that's where we pull up like the Declaration of Human Rights. And there are many violations that we found, but specifically we looked at Article 3 and 7. And Article 3 looks at the right to life, liberty, and security. And then Article 7 of the Declaration of Human Rights looks at we are all equal before the law without discrimination. And that includes like equal protection by the law. And so we would say that through our research, it suggests that like these human rights are not being upheld, they are being violated by our systems. And so I think we can look at this issue with like a human rights perspective, but also we come from like a faith community, and so how can we look at this with that type of lens? And I think God calls us to have like radically open hearts for those around us, and especially the suffering of those around us. So when we look at justice, it isn't something that just social work majors should have, it's something that isn't defined by majors or life experiences, but it's something we can all pick up. And when we look at like the dignity and worth that like God bestows on everyone, like if we are allowing a system to take that away from these women, then we are not upholding that call. And we just kind of wanted to conclude with this quote. Katie talked about policy. A lot of policy is done by grassroots organizations or Indigenous communities talking on this issue directly. And so this is one quote a woman shared. And we just want to recognize like it's one presentation and we can't like take in all the like complex layers and factors that play into this, but just recognizing that through like personal awareness, jurisdictional awareness, like we can bring change to the issue. And I think just knowing that like our actions here and like as we go out like have direct impact on the change that happens in communities, and with the information and advocacy that like we hope people take from this, just hoping that we can like aid in the fight so that this doesn't have to continue to be a reality in the communities around us.
And so that kind of wraps up our portion here. And so we're going to invite our co-presenters up, and we'll move into kind of a Q&A for anybody to ask.
Oh, and also our presentation boards when you leave that we set up for in Florida are in the back. So when you leave, you can grab a policy brief, some justice pins, and then glance at our presentations as well. So are there any questions about either presentation, the experience as a whole?
So for Alyssa and Katie, I was curious about the missing data. That's interesting to me because I mean I study the developing world, and missing data is a huge problem there too. So do you have a sense of why there's that recent shift? I mean, it's curious to me that I guess it goes on that long, but that there are a number of cases we've documented since 2010. It sounds like the real policy moves are happening just in the last couple of years. So what changes around in the early 2000s to make that better?
Yeah. So he asked what has kind of been the changes that have occurred since the early 2000s, since we talked about the missing data between the 1940s and 2010. And I would suggest, I guess I'm not entirely aware of what that might be, but based on our research, would just be that the awareness of the issue and people becoming more aware of how do we define people, like how are we making sure that our policies are meeting the needs to represent the dignity and worth of all people. And so For example, when we were looking at how classifications were used, up until the early 2000s, like an N was used for a very derogatory name instead of Native American. And so that is one change that has come about, is just recognizing of how can we be more inclusive for people who identify as various, names, whether that's indigenous or Indian American or Aboriginal, but also within like their tribal and their clans as well. I don't know if you have anything else that you want to tell.
Well, and I think it's interesting, all of our sources are from like 2010, 2011 and above, most of them from 2018. And so just looking at like the grassroots movements that are happening, I think it's been going on for all these years that the data has been missing, but I think it's just finally getting that platform, and that's why the call for the task force to include indigenous tribal members, whether leaders or just like community members, is so significant, because the issue's been there, they've acknowledged it. It's just now mainstream society that's starting to like catch wind of what's going on.
And to add on to that, you can see that with the Savannah's Act, the Task Force Act in Minnesota, and then even the Washington State Patrol, that's all just having task force to look into and make recommendations. That's not necessarily even having the implementation of creating opportunities for victims or their families, or anybody in the community that's impacted by the trauma of missing and murdered Indigenous women. These are just kind of starting to be the beginning, and like Alyssa said, it's all starting kind of with advocacy groups that are mainly comprised of Indigenous members of Indigenous community. Good question.
I have a question. For Katie and Alyssa, when you guys have looked at your research for which states are like following suit, like Washington and Minnesota, are there any others that are passing a bill about Indigenous women or people for murderings that are going on?
Yeah, so she asked if we looked into North Dakota and Minnesota and Washington, and then she was wondering if there's other states that have also continued to look or pass bills for task force.
Yeah, I believe there's nothing on a federal level at this point, and for most states there is not anything going on. There may be like small lobbying groups, but there were only just a handful of states that have even like started trying to pass a bill, and that's why there's only 3 main ones right now that have passed something related to either a task force or just trying to bring recognition to the violence in these communities. So unfortunately, there isn't much going on policy-wise right now.
But the hopes is that as these states start to talk about it and awareness starts to happen, as people go out and talk about it and are aware of it, that other states would follow suit.
For Madeline and Squad, how do you think that like the media portrayal of the caravan has really impacted like either the positive or negative like implications of what has gone on through like federally, and also just as citizens looking at the news and what it could be portrayed as? The question. Yeah, so the question was how has media influenced the positive and negative portrayals and like policy implications of the migrant caravan? And I think because of some of the lens that the Trump administration has put onto the caravan through policies that are being discussed and other restrictions that he wants to implement, I think that's definitely kind of made a more negative portrayal on the migrant caravan and the crisis in general, and kind of how it's, it seems like this world crisis, and it's a crisis everywhere, but people need safe places to live, and making threats and making requirements harder isn't necessarily the right way to do that, or maybe the best way to do that.
I also think too that the Trump administration's language around the migrant caravan and individuals trying to reach safety has been very demonizing, as well as it just puts the entire crisis in a negative light instead of humanizing the individuals behind that are coming to the United States to reach safety. So.
Related to that, I mean, do you have some sense, like, so you said 90% of people are getting the clearance to be classified as they have a legitimate sort of political oppression they're experiencing, but only 10% are getting granted asylum status. Do you have a sense of, like, what kind of criteria we're using, why those 10% and why not the other kind of 80% of these people who are not receiving that? Or do you, I mean, and maybe we just don't know that, I don't know, but is there any sense of how the government's assessing that?
Yeah. So the question was asked, kind of why is there a disparity between 90% passing the credible fear screening and only 10% then getting cleared for asylum? And I don't have a matter-of-fact answer for that. I know that a lot of the demonization behind this comes from wanting to deter and discourage asylum seekers to enter the United States. And as according to last night, Trump has issued a fee on this, on the credible fear screening and seeking asylum. So a lot of it, I think, is just to discourage numbers coming into the United States.
Any other final questions?
Same as this one.
And then just to kind of close to wrap up both of our topics, like they're two very distinct human rights issues going on right now, but there are so many other ones, and these may not be what everyone is interested in, but that's why the beauty of it, the hardship is that there is so much to look at. The beauty is that there is a role for all of us to play in it. And so we just wanted to share a quote to end it by Eleanor Roosevelt that says, "Where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world." So that is happening on campus, in friendships, in families, in the agencies we're going to work for, and it's just in the people we bump into. Like, it's a call that it doesn't have to be some grand action that we commit to, but it's just those things every day where we are at this time.
Just adding to that too, I think it doesn't have to be a social worker's responsibility alone to uphold human rights. Like if you're political science, business, your education, like anybody can uphold the human rights of people.
So we'll be around if you had maybe a question, but you didn't necessarily want to ask for the whole group. Feel free to come up and talk to us. We'll be here for a few more minutes. Otherwise, that concludes the rest of our presentation.